Welcome. Thanks for coming. My name is Charles Fisher, and I'd like to welcome you to the Humanity Alliance in partnership with EDC's Honors Program. Today we're honored to hear Dr. Steve Porn, whose talk is entitled, "We Still Need Your Belligerent Uncle, Building a Politics That Can Actually Do Something and Might Even Make You Happier." As a belligerent uncle myself, I'm happy to hear what Steve has to say. Will you please give me a warm welcome for Dr. Steve Porn.
All right, thanks, Charles. So the subtitle of my talk is Building a Politics That Can Actually Do Something and Might Even Make You Happier. I have to admit, I typically bootstrap in the theme of these symposiums and pretty much do a talk based on whatever happens to be irking me at the moment. But I do promise that part of the talk will connect with the idea of how does political science, how might political science help you live a happier life. But I do admit that some of this is maybe a little bit of a stretch, though I think the theme throughout can probably be detected, and then I'll have a specific reference at the end. The other part of my title, the main part, "We Still Need Your Belligerent Uncle." Let me explain that. First, the still. I'm basically reprising the talk that I did for the Honors Symposium last year. So the still is this is a very important issue, set of questions and things to think about. Just as it was last year, perhaps even more so, more pressing this year, and I'll explain why. The belligerent uncle piece of that, perhaps a number of us are belligerent uncles. I probably am thought of as that by some of my relatives, but I mean a particular thing when I say that. I'm referring to a politically retrograde uncle, perhaps one, especially if you consider yourself to be progressive, who you get in arguments with at the Thanksgiving dinner table or somewhere else. So I want to talk about how those folks, and of course all of us, are central if we want to not only make happier lives but a just world. So I thought, since I have a lot of moving parts, that for this lecture, for this talk, I would present you with an abstract, and I would give you that argument straight out, though by the time I finished doing that, my abstract had a lot of moving parts. So I hope this is clear, and I'm happy to answer questions, especially at the end of the talk. But let me read this to you, and I do think I'm cutting against the grain of what progressives typically think of when they formulate a view of justice. So I'm arguing that as our declining neoliberal order confronts a variety of crises and political disruptions, the stakes of finding a strategic path forward become ever higher. Our current politics have generated at least three competing options. The first, offered by the political right, dangles an age-old divide and conquer lure that tempts the majority white population against minorities and other marginalized groups. This is, of course, no solution and is likely to lead to fascism or its cousin Christian nationalism. Meanwhile, the progressive left is divided. On the one hand, the dominant liberal identity politics of the Democratic Party focuses on efforts to reform biased attitudes and promote diverse demographic representation in all sectors of society. On the other hand, there is an older and somewhat misunderstood and underappreciated left tradition of solidarity that seeks to organize the working class around a broad set of universalist goals that would repair, reconstruct, or reimagine institutions and potentially the social order from the ground up. Examining wealth distribution in the United States, along with other considerations, not the least being the comparative political viability of the two strategies, helps us see the solidarity model as a far superior option for progressives to follow. Ironically, and this is important, it also, the solidarity model, offers the best hope of achieving the main goals of the liberal identity-based strategies. Okay, that was more than a mouthful. So let's see how good I am at teasing this out. First, I want to emphasize the crucial moment the critical moment we have arrived at. And political scientist Adolph Reed Jr., I think, has presented a compelling framing of where we stand. He essentially argues that we have arrived at a T-shaped intersection, or at least you can think of our society and political system as having arrived metaphorically at a T-shaped intersection. And we have two choices. We can go to the right, which could essentially mean authoritarianism of some type, fascism, Christian nationalism, or we could go to the left and achieve what I view is a much more justice-producing society, a social democracy. Reed writes, a key practical reason to stress the danger on the horizon is the possibility that the national and global political economic order we've known as neoliberalism has evolved to a point at which it is no longer capable of providing enough benefits, opportunity, and security to enough of the population to maintain its popular legitimacy. I have a helpful, I hope, definition of neoliberalism there. Corporate capitalism operating without any serious democratic challenge from the working class. So essentially what Reed is arguing here is neoliberalism, the form of capitalism that we have, that has organized life in this country for approximately 45 years, has run its course. It hasn't made enough. That's the reason why we see so much political disruption on both the right and the left, is because the economic system is not able to satisfy enough people's needs. And again, we're at this T-shaped intersection where we're going to go either to the left or we're going to go to the right. Now, for people like me, there are very disturbing signs all over the place suggesting we're going to the right. So all I needed to do was pull the most recent polling for the presidential race. And I would direct you especially to the battleground states. This does not include North Carolina, but it wouldn't help you think any more positively if you saw that. But Donald Trump leads Biden in what amounts to 6 out of the 7 battleground states that will determine the presidency. And that, to me, despite Biden's considerable flaws that I will happily discuss with you, is nevertheless an alarming trend suggesting that we are on the cusp of a rightward lurch. Now, how can this happen? Why would this be a possibility if it would be such a disaster as I'm suggesting? I think we need to understand the strategy behind right-wing identitarianism itself. That is, the right has its own brand of identity politics. It's very critical of identity politics, and I'm going to offer some criticisms of liberal identity politics today. But the right has its own version of that. And it boils down to sort of the age-old divide and conquer, creating a politics of us and them, essentially. Raising the salience, and this is very important, of bigoted attitudes. This is where the belligerent uncle comes into play. The right is very adept at raising the salience of the attitudes that you see on the right there, which is a news clip of a recent news story. Trump defends comments about immigrants poisoning the blood of America. That's what that sort of politics looks like, right? You frequently hear people talking about they're taking over, some outcast group. They're cutting in line, right, for the American dream. They're taking what's rightfully mine and then, the poisoning of the culture sort of stuff. This is recent, a couple of years ago during the midterm elections, congressional elections in 2022. Stephen Miller, who was one of Trump's kind of henchmen during the first Trump administration, created a political ad, and I took some screenshots of it, pitting COVID relief, various forms of COVID relief, framing it as anti-white, right? So this is a classic right-wing sort of move. So Biden's restaurant relief program excludes white male owners, right? Which of course it didn't, but that's not the point. Kamala, non-white citizens first, right? And progressives discriminating against white Americans. That's the underlying theme, right? That's dividing people up, right? It's very useful. Now, disturbingly, if that wasn't enough, there's evidence that a good percentage of Americans are being attracted by this sort of rhetoric. So the follow-up to the story I put up a couple slides ago is that half of Americans agree, more or less, with this framing that immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country. So it's enough, I think, for many of us to wonder whether or not this is just not who we are as a people, and to start believing that racism, bigotry of the type I've been describing is just part of the fundamental DNA of this country. And Ibrahim Kendi, in his book Stamped from the Beginning, certainly makes this case, presenting it as sort of a trans-historical phenomenon. What I mean by that, it's a fancy way of saying that it's everywhere all the time, doesn't go away, right? So we think we're making progress, but we're really not. In other words, maybe this is just something that's natural. I understand the temptation to believe this, but I think it's wrong, right? And I think we have some strong evidence that it's wrong. I highly recommend this book, book that came out actually a few decades ago at this point, written by Theodore Allen, called The Invention of the White Race. And here's why I think it is crucial. It provides an origin story of racism in the United States, or actually starting in colonial America. And one of the observations that Allen makes in the book, and this is the result of him, I mean, he was a tireless scholar. He's passed on at this point. But he's a tireless scholar, and he examined the county records in colonial Virginia from 1619. Probably know that date. It's the first arrival of African slaves in the colonies. Through that century. And his observation, after having pored over those records, was that when the first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, there were no white people. Nor, according to the colonial records, would there be for another 60 years. What does that mean? How do we unpack that? What it means is there was no such thing as white racial identity at that time. It hadn't been constructed. It wasn't a natural thing. In point of fact, bonded European laborers often worked side by side with African slaves. They spent their leisure time together. They intermarried. And as Allen shows, they organized together to fight a ruling class which was exploiting both of the groups. Now, the turning point that Allen finds is Bacon's Rebellion, which probably everybody in here has heard about, maybe hasn't thought much more than just the name, though. Bacon's rebellion begins in 1676 and is first a struggle between elites. But it evolves into a conflict where the bottom of society, all of these European bonded laborers and African slaves, join together, organize together, and fight back against their ruling class exploiters. And they take over Jamestown. They burn Jamestown to the ground and take over the colony for months. But the important point here is this demonstrates these people's ability to organize and work together towards a common end. Now, they were both interested in overcoming exploitation overcoming exploitation. But the elite class manages to get control of the colony sooner or later. And there is where the ruling class makes a move that will reverberate throughout American history. And that is they start to create, through policy changes and laws, the, as Alan calls it, the poison bait of white skin privilege. That is, they tempt whites in the colony to start thinking of themselves as different. They ostracize free blacks from the political system. They create a matrimonial avenue for slavery so that if your mother was a slave, you were going to be a slave forever. And they institute propaganda campaigns trying to, and successfully eventually, getting people to take on white skin privilege, the notion that there is something valuable to be had in your skin, with white skin. But the important point here, I think, is that this did not come naturally. I don't think it's fair to say that racism is part of the DNA of this country when we have these decades-long periods at the start where European bonded laborers are working with and organizing with African slaves. It's only after this that those kinds of divisions, and the purpose, of course, from the view of the ruling class, is to prevent this from happening again, to divide and conquer. Right? Now, the reason why Alan, among other reasons, Alan says that this was the poison bait, is that whites, many whites, most whites, essentially allow themselves to be tempted. And despite the fact that they're given perks and benefits connected to whiteness, they are still being exploited. Right? So now both groups are being exploited, but it is exceptionally difficult to see a way where they will organize together and overturn the ruling class that's exploiting them. So, but I think the bottom line here is that racism is not in the DNA of the country. We have evidence that that's not true, that identity is not a barrier to organization. So if racism was created, if racism was a ruling class project, that suggests it can be fought. Right? The question is, how? How do you fight it? Now, one answer is the now, I think it's fair to say, dominant liberal democratic response. And this response, attempt to overcome racism and bigotry, focuses on rehabilitating individuals, rehabilitating bigoted attitudes, employing diversity training to do that, getting people to acknowledge their white privilege, accounting for implicit biases. These are biases that are reactionary. You don't even think about them. Probably the most dangerous of implicit biases involves police shooting African Americans because of a response that they will perceive danger when it isn't there, right? Other strategies involve catering to the most marginalized voices in the room, or centering, I mean, decentering whiteness, reforming or rooting out bad apples in law enforcement and elsewhere, diversifying the workforce and positions of power in the name of representation. The bottom line here is to change the hearts and minds of people and make America and its institutions look like America. Right. Now, I'm going to be critical of this position, but I want to make it clear that especially when it comes to people working at the grassroots, say here at this college or elsewhere, within the framework of liberal identity politics, as I've described, I have a great deal of respect for them, and I think they have the best of intentions. I think reducing bigotry, or at least trying to, and promoting basic respect are goals that any reasonable and thoughtful person and society should undertake. Nevertheless, I think there are some crucial problems with this approach. So, first, does it work? Key question, right? Unfortunately, diversity training requires, and there's now pretty overwhelming evidence of this, requires that people be willing to change bigoted attitudes going into the training in order for that to have any kind of meaning for them. So what happens is that those trainings end up preaching to the choir. The problem is that with regard to everybody else, so think in terms of your belligerent uncle, there is produced a backlash. And more likely or not, they're going to have worse racial attitudes than when they came in. So that's one problem. Implicit bias helps us see that discriminatory impulses are all around us. However, there is, to this date, no effective intervention on that sort of quick trigger thinking or bias. I would like to suggest that the privilege discourse, the white privilege discourse, offloads guilt and responsibility to the individual rather than the society or the institutions of that society. It does, in a really important way, the rights work for it by dividing the working class, right? So you might think in terms of colonial Virginia here, dividing the working class, setting up a zero-sum framework in an already desperate times. So 45 years of neoliberalism, adding this in only creates more political division. And you can see it in those voting results that I've attached here at the bottom. The white working class overwhelmingly voted for Trump as opposed to Hillary Clinton in 2016. There's something deeply wrong with that. Those voters used to support New Deal politics, right? And frankly, during a much more overtly racist period. So that's a problem. Ultimately, I think, liberal identity politics simply just does not produce the justice that it promotes. So there's a lot of rhetoric about dismantling racism, transforming the society. But I don't think the efforts actually match up with what's going, with what actually is produced or not produced. I would like to focus, if you will, on white privilege discourse in particular. And I can't do justice to it. We could probably have an entire quarter where we focused on this topic. But you're probably familiar, most of you, with the Peggy McIntosh invisible knapsack of white privilege. You see some of it up here. And I think, just at the outset, I would acknowledge that soul searching is healthy, right, for people to realize maybe when they have privilege relative to other people. But it's also fair to say, I think, that it's not a political program. So while I would say some privileges are worth abandoning, and here I'm thinking in particular about a recent study that found that at the Supreme Court, the white male justices were constantly interrupting the female justices. And it didn't go vice versa, right? Now, that seems to me the type of privilege that a thoughtful person would want to identify and move away from, right? So that seems reasonable to me. But I would also say that many so-called privileges or involve expectations that all human beings should have. So, for example, one of the listed items or privileges that Peggy McIntosh notes is, I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured I will not be followed or harassed. That's something all people should be able to do, right? Now, I'm echoing what Hadass Silver in the talk I asked you to listen to, some of you enrolled in this class, the debate about white privilege, so you may recognize this language. But she argues that privilege ends up being, talking about rights that way, it ends up being a very regressive way to talk about rights that all should enjoy. And it has the effect also of turning attention away from the perpetrator. You're focused on the people getting a benefit rather than those dealing it out in a discriminatory way, which is a problem. Maybe think about it this way. When the abolitionists were opposing slavery, they didn't talk about the fact that they were lucky to be, they were privileged to be free. They talked about slavery being a crime against humanity. Right, so I think framing the questions that we're thinking about here in terms of why privilege is problematic. And we should also remember Allen's point, Theodore Allen, invention of the white race. And that white skin privilege, that temptation, that poison bait, that lure for, they started thinking of themselves as white people, was meant to give them just enough so that they would continue to accept living in an otherwise exploitative society, definitely for the African slaves, but also for them. So the white skin privilege, white privilege notion is connected to preserving the status quo. It's worth thinking about what the status quo is today. Here's one way of looking at it: the racial wealth gap. I want to spend a moment here and make sure everybody understands exactly what you're looking at. The dark blue, is that dark blue? Looks dark blue to me. Portion of the graph, this is all white wealth. So there's a mountain of white wealth, and it's measuring white wealth, black wealth, Latinx wealth, other minority categories, their wealth over time. So it starts in 1989, right? You see this? Goes up to 2022. I mean, if you're looking for white privilege, it looks like there it is, right? Does that make sense that I would say that? Massive white wealth. Here, the light blue is African American wealth, which is minuscule in comparison, right? So, white privilege looks pretty clear. But I think this framing misses a crucial truth about wealth distribution in America. This is the wealth gap, with everybody included. Right? It's not divided by race, it's everybody in the United States. Household wealth. What do you see here? It's concentrated overwhelmingly at the top, right? The very top 10% holds 73% of the wealth. The bottom half of the country, right, has 2% of the wealth, or almost nothing. The bottom 70%, those don't sound like they go together, do they? The bottom 70%. Most of the population has only 8% of the wealth. So it truly, maybe you're starting to think about colonial Virginia again, but a truly unequal society. What this means is that if you solved the racial gap, the racial wealth gap, in the bottom 90% of the population, so the racial groups are all equal, right? That would only solve, that would leave 3/4 of the problem unsolved. That is to say that the racial wealth gap is largely a tussle at the top. And we can slice this in a number of different ways. Here is the percentage distribution. Here's the distribution of white wealth. This is only white people. Right? So all of that wealth over there on the left, the big wave of growing wealth since 1989, well, this is how it actually shakes out. That's not exactly white wealth. That's rich people white wealth. Because most of it is over here in the top 10%. Half to 70% of white people own almost nothing. You see that? We can slice it by African American wealth as well. And you get the same picture. Now, I think I said this on the next slide, but this does call into some question the idea of representation, like in terms of firsts. Maybe think of it this way. Does it help me that Elon Musk owns tens of billions of dollars? I mean, he's a white person, right? So my team's winning. It doesn't, right? And pick your favorite person in each category and ask whether that helps the vast majority of people in that category. Right. Here is Latino wealth, divided essentially the same way. It's concentrated at the top. Now, I thought I'd throw this in as well because it's troubling. But I guess when you look at this chart, this is the percent of wealth owned by those with only a high school education. Unlike the other distributions, most of it's concentrated up at the top. Maybe we would imagine people getting lucky. Most of these folks have almost no wealth, though. You see that. Maybe this means that we could close some of the gaps that we're looking at here through closing educational opportunity gaps, which I think, by the way, are a good idea for their own reasons, for separate reasons than this. But when we look at the gap amongst those with a college degree, we find out that won't do it either, right? This is the percent wealth owned by each wealth decile amongst those with a college degree, right? So unfortunately, despite the fact that it's still a good idea, closing educational opportunity gaps will not change the distribution of wealth amongst even those with college degrees. In fact, no matter how we slice the wealth, most of society is held at the very top. And so I collected all of the different graphs from the article that I was drawing from, so you can see the imagery and compare it to the other way of framing things as a racial wealth gap, right? So this is Matt Brunig, the person who wrote the article and presented the information. The fact that we see the same wealth distribution over and over again, no matter how we slice the data, is a pretty solid indicator that this particular distributive skew is driven by the rules of our economic system, neoliberal capitalism, not a contingent issue with one group or another. Right. So here's a thought experiment. I mean, perhaps it would be a good idea to be good enough to shift the demographics at the top of society. Make sure that it all shook out. 50% of the top are women, 13% are African American, whatever the percentages are, make sure that that happens. The question here, if every industry and all leadership positions in the country were distributed proportionally, according to the demographic characteristics of the American people, would that be a just society? Maybe a more radical question is, if racial bigotry, sexism, and other identity-based bigotries ended tomorrow, would that produce a just society? My proposed answer to this is, if position, power, and wealth were distributed proportionally by demographic category and bigotry was eliminated, society would be more just, right? But it would not be a just society, not even close. That is, if rotten institutions remained untouched, we would be left with a rainbow oligarchy as a replacement for our currently predominantly white oligarchy. How might we think about all this? Now, at the beginning, I spent a moment or two urging upon you the idea that I have great respect for folks who are involved in equity work, that are involved in the DEI programs here on campus. But I think it's fair to say that, especially those in the ruling elite that are involved in this sort of politics, that they're up to something different. I would like to persuade my brothers and sisters in the DEI department that a different thrust is necessary in order to make a just society. But I have no doubts that the folks who are doing it amongst the ruling class know exactly what they're doing and how little these sorts of efforts are likely to become real change, right? So how to understand that looking from the top? How to understand this situation that I'm describing looking from the top? We live in a radically unequal society characterized by massive wealth at the top, massive maldistribution of wealth. From the top, there's an interest, a need, just like in the midst of Bacon's rebellion, to deflect political energy, or after Bacon's rebellion, deflect political energy that might challenge this unjust realm. The right, as I've noted, deflects through appeals to racism. The left, though, liberal identity politics, it's not the left. Liberal identity politics serves the same end by allowing ruling elites to focus on mostly symbolic change. Now, I would much prefer a world in which they won. I'd much prefer a world in which the liberal identity elites win and the rightists who want to divide us by race lose. Certainly preferable, I think, but it still is not justice. Let me give you some specific ways in which I think elite capture, which is the framing and the terminology that Olufemi Taiwo, an important philosopher examining this sort of thing, puts it. So recently, REI, you know, the Outback outlet center store, held an employee meeting, and it's recorded, so I just listened to it yesterday so to remind myself. And at this meeting with the CEO and the chief diversity officer of REI comes in and first dutifully identifies themselves by their pronouns and acknowledges, they do a land acknowledgement, right? But then they turn, after those progressive moves, they turn to make the case to their employees that, well, REI doesn't think unionization is the right thing for its employees at this time. So feigning in a progressive direction, which is really misdirection, I'm a progressive, right, while dividing the workers against unionization. My understanding is that Amazon and Starbucks have done similar things recently. Starbucks going as far as providing rights for their trans employees and then threatening to take those rights away if they unionize.
We can add Edward Community College to the list of REI, Starbucks, and Amazon.
Can you say more about that?
Oh, there's a massive labor situation. There's pure exploitation. 7% of the faculty are adjuncts.
Yeah, I want to get to that.
And so it's a real, I mean, it's not just these companies, it's really the whole
Yeah.
neoliberal project, of which we're
Thank you.
implicated here. Very serious.
Yeah, I would say that for all the work that our college has done to try to address injustice, it has left the biggest exploitative relationship untouched. And in my perspective has not done anything to really address this, and that is what you're getting at. The fact that 60 to 70% of your instructors are adjuncts and have no assurance that they will have classes next quarter and are, I think, clear examples of exploited work. Right. Another example here, or gesture towards what I'm getting at. If you don't change rotten institutions, it does not matter who you put in them, right? So I think we're at a moment here, actually, where this is brutally clear to us, right? So Republicans, I think it's fair to say, even amongst my Republican students in the room, they're not going to feign in the direction of having Black Lives Matter on their B-52. They aren't going to have the pride flag or anything like that. It's going to bomb the crap out of people, right? The problem is metaphorically and in reality, the Democrats are going to do the same thing, right? So it's a progressive feign. The Pentagon wants us to think of itself as being tremendously progressive and diversifying, right? So does the CIA, right? These institutions that have not been helpful to everyday people ever in the history of those organizations. But the brutal reality right now is the American military machine is behind Israel as it commits genocide in Gaza. And not just since October 7th, but since at least 1967, has supported an apartheid regime. It has supported ethnic cleansing, and finally, occupation and genocide, right? You would think that a society committed to diversity and diversifying elite institutions would not act in this way, right? So I guess the question is, I've done a lot of criticism. Is there a path forward that would lead us to higher level of happiness? Right, getting that in there. But would produce a more just world, and I think we do have an option, right? I think the solidarity model is the path. It's no guarantee. And believe me, there have been unions and laborers within those unions who have acted in tremendously racist ways, especially thinking in terms of immediately after the Civil War. W.E.B. Du Bois lamented in his Black Reconstruction in America, published in 1935, that white laborers and black laborers were two groups with identical interests, and they couldn't come together after the Civil War. And it just stupid. Right? It is notable, though, that by the 1890s, during the populist uprise, that you did see examples similar to what I described in 17th century Virginia. You saw black and white workers uniting behind a populist agenda. And in fact, historian Judith Stein is the foremost historian who has put together the evidence that that's one of the key reasons why ruling elites in the South complicit and northern elites complicitly allowed and created the Jim Crow system to further divide the working class. And in fact, Theodore Allen, back to him, argues that in every important moment where the economy, especially the society, is in crisis, you will see this divide and conquer attempt. I think a new addition here, though, is that the liberal identity model has also now been leveraged towards this end. But the best answer is solidarity, and it can get your belligerent uncle on board, right? It's not a guarantee. But by seeking universal benefits, not just for some, for all of the working class, like universal health care, affordable housing, free higher ed, student debt relief, daycare, elderly care, a living wage, pay for home labor. Women still do most of the work, and for free, right? Community control of police, reconceiving public safety, reconceiving public health for that matter, pursuing an equitable climate policy and building a working class democracy. The solidarity model is the potential road path that could have potential success. Now, the strategy behind the solidarity model is coalition building. That is creating broad movements that can win real material gains for people. So instead of talking to your belligerent uncle about race, you talk about something that he needs, right? You try to lower the salience of bigoted attitudes and raise the salience of the kinds of things that everybody needs, the material goods that everybody needs. This approach has the potential to fundamentally alter what is possible also in electoral politics. So I'm sure some of you are frustrated with the choices that we have when it comes time to vote for any election or for president. A lot of that has to do with the fact that we just don't have a meaningful solidarity left movement that could change the context in which politics happens. If you do that, I think then a whole different array of candidates and different policies are possible. And I think one thing to notice is that the solidarity model I'm describing here aligns with the strategy of the most important and successful movements in American history. So that boils down to a question of, where does change come from? And I would suggest that just about anything you like about this country came from a solidarity movement. So think about the anti-slavery movement. Think about various waves of the women's movement, or women's movements. Think about the labor movement, of course, civil rights movement, anti-war movements, the LGBTQ movement, the BLM movement. All of these involved broad coalitions, and they work best when they are diverse. The Combahee River collective statement that I have here gestures to an important point that I want to make about the goals of the liberal identity model and how they could actually be furthered more purposefully by the solidarity model. So the irony is that the solidarity model offers the best hope of achieving those main goals, the main goals of the liberal identity-based strategy of reducing bigotry, reducing racism. And social scientists have found that repeated contacts between people in a situation where they're equals, both fighting for the same things, that's when the bigotry falls away, right? At least that's the potential, right? There are no guarantees in life, but that's the potential. And I put this up here to gesture towards some of the early research on this, found by a couple of researchers who studied white and black troops who fought in World War II. And these researchers found that whites whose companies had been joined by black platoons showed dramatically lower racial animus and a greater willingness to work alongside blacks than those whose companies remained segregated. And indeed, that's what the whole diversity project at the beginning was. Not about representation. You know, Barack Obama is president for people like me. No, it was about putting people together that were supposedly diverse and different and having them interact and realize that we're all basically the same. That was the original project, right? And the solidarity movement helps actually bring that to life in practice. Here's more recent information. I've linked this article to if you want to, that unions are essential for eliminating racism. Okay, I told you I'd get to this. What does any of this have to do with happiness? Well, joining a union is good for your well-being, right? Increased job satisfaction and pay, security and support from fellow workers so you have community, something that I think the right has argued is missing from this society. Voice in the workplace, you get work-life balance because you're not working 80 hours a week. You have a sense there is something you can do about the problems you and others face, and a potentially at least, the opportunity, the mechanisms through which you can achieve those changes. Right. So I think the bottom line here would be transform institutions through the solidarity movements, coalition building, pressing the system. And the attitudes that we are definitely still concerned about will follow. So I would suggest that plug in where you can, join a union, maybe help your colleagues at work form a union. If you're in a union, maybe work to make your union a fighting union, right? Now, just a word on that, I would suggest that my union, I love my local, I serve on my local union, but I'm not sure we're a fighting union, right? And I think if we were, we would probably address the situation that you mentioned concerning adjuncts, who are the main body of our unionized workforce in not just this college, but in Washington State. So I think one task for us, me included, would be to move towards a more a fighting union where we provide justice for most of the people who call themselves instructors in this system. I think this quote right here is a good one to end on. It has to do with the attitudes versus action that I think is important to focus on. So Stokely Carmichael, Black Panther from the 1960s, said, if a white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. If he's got the power to lynch me, that's my problem. Racism is not a question of attitude, it's a question of power. So for those of us on the left, the question is not our attitudes, but whether we have the power. Thank you.